Hello and welcome to another episode of A Conversation with Carl. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Itai Flesher. Itai is the Education Director at Seeds of Peace, Jerusalem, an interfaith youth movement that empowers Israeli and Palestinian young people to create more just and peaceful communities. His debut book, The Holy and the Broken, which is a great read, a cry for Israeli-Palestinian peace from a land that must be shared. Itai is currently the Jerusalem correspondent for the Jewish Independent from Australia. Welcome, Itai Flesher, to the conversation.
Shukran Kadir, toda rabba. It's wonderful to be here with you today from my home in Jerusalem.
Thank you so much for doing this. Let's start with The Holy and the Broken talks to choosing humanity over sides, a statement that is emblazoned on the book's cover. Tell us what choosing humanity means to you and how you think we can achieve this.
So I started writing this book on October 10th, which is 3 days after the immense tragedy that my country experienced on October 7th. And when I say tragedy, I mean that it was a tragedy for me. It was horror, it was murder, it was sexual assault, it was shock, it was trauma of hundreds of years coming back. It was a crisis of faith for people that work in peacebuilding. It was all of those things. And then I thought, what do I do at this moment when all of these feelings are going through my mind? And I probably should have just gone to see a therapist, but instead I started writing a book. And I was talking to people all the time. I was talking to people on the left, on the right, people that support Hamas, people that oppose Hamas, people that support the Israeli government, oppose the Israeli government. And I had all these voices in my head, as you do when you're a journalist, and you have all these voices, and then I have all these friends in my life as well. And what the book says, which is maybe sounds very straightforward when you're not living in a war zone, but when you are in the situation and the work that I do is not straightforward at all, is that for there to be peace, one of the first dragons we need to slay is the dragon of dehumanization. Dehumanization is a process where through many years, actions, religious teachings, all sorts of things, you come to see your neighbor as less human than you are. And you come to see their beliefs and their actions and everything they do as not being motivated by the same things that motivated your actions because you're human and they're not. And dehumanization is a process that's been happening in both Israeli and Palestinian society for a very, very long time. And it's really reached its pinnacle now over the last two and a half years. And so the book is sort of a handbook of how to navigate and be aware of that process and how it happened and then how to undo it as well.
So how do we navigate this? Because everybody seems to be in a bubble. And if you're on the left, you're in your bubble. You're on the right, you're in your bubble. And with social media, it's all being echoed in your bubbles. So now you feel like I'm right. So how do you get to this point that we can all talk to each other?
So the first step is there's a lot of denial about this process of dehumanization. On the Palestinian side, there was a lot of denial about the atrocities that were done by Hamas on October 7th, the sexual assault, the kidnapping of civilians, the massacre at the Nova Festival, and that denial still exists in some quarters to this very day. And that denial is based on a belief that the holy martyrs, the resistance fighters, do these horrible things that the Jews are claiming they did. And then there's further denial about Jewish Israeli suffering of Israeli hostages, the torture they endured whilst they were in captivity. There's denial now about the suffering of Israelis during the past Iran war. And that denial is deeply hurtful to Jews, not just in Israel, but around the world. I mean, it manifests in many ways, sometimes through violence, sometimes through acts of antisemitism on synagogues around the world. And so the first step to confronting that dehumanization is being aware that there are facts and there's denial, and that denial needs to be countered. And the same thing is also now happening on the Israeli side. There's immense denial about the suffering that the IDF caused in Gaza to many innocent civilians. There's a lot of denial about the fact that there was hunger in Gaza, denial about the fact that the manner in which targets was chosen wasn't always just for self-defense reasons, that many Palestinians who were forced to leave their homes then had their homes demolished, and 80% of the population now doesn't have a house and is nowhere near getting a house. And generally when when Palestinians or their allies bring up that suffering or the immense pain and loss for people from Deir al-Balah and Jabalia and Gaza City and Rafah, that's often met with, whataboutism and blame and, all of these sorts of things rather than taking responsibility for that. And so I think the first step is sort of reading news from multiple sources. People often believe that all Palestinians are liars unless they say things we agree with, and Palestinians believe all Jews are liars unless they say things that we agree with. And so it's a matter of, we often want to only believe, a certain part of the population that is speaking our narrative, but to read widely, to read things you agree with, read things you disagree with, talk to people. And don't talk just to people you agree with, talk to people you disagree with, and don't just talk about politics, talk about their life and their children and their hopes for this land and their education and their beliefs about God and Allah and how they want to raise their children in this land, and talk about how they feel about normal things like traffic jams and the weather as well. Like, when you build relationships with people on the other side, you get to step 2, which is humanization. So first you overcome denial, then you start having conversations, then you have humanization. You start seeing that these people that are on the other side of the border or the wall or the checkpoint from you aren't that different from you. And then you go to the third step, which is talking about what you want the future of this land to look like. I think it's very clear what Israelis are against, and it's very clear what Palestinians are against. But in these dialogues, and I facilitate these dialogues all the time in Jerusalem, a lot of what we talk about is not the past or the present, but the future. And then we sit together and we imagine, what do we want the city to look like? What does security mean? What does freedom mean? What does equality mean? What does justice mean? And then having those conversations allows you to get out of that cycle of denial and blame and revenge, and to begin a process of imagining a future where this land can be shared.
One of the things, when I heard you speak, you talked about how when the conversation starts with a Palestinian and an Israeli, you'll start having them talk about which is better, TikTok or Instagram.
Yes.
And I thought that's a really interesting way to start a conversation, because it's teaching you how to argue your point of view, and it's teaching you how to listen to someone else.
Yeah. So it's true, like, a lot of children in school are taught how to debate, and many schools have debating clubs even, where, you learn how to make points and then rebut the points of the argument, and how to stand up and be aggressive and be confident and sort of know your facts. And if you search Israel-Palestine on YouTube, you'll find hundreds of these kind of debates, between, really smart Oxford educated people who will, try and get sort of, smackdowns on the other side, so that you can get some viral video on TikTok that will go for 60 seconds. But that's not dialogue. Dialogue is where, when someone says something you disagree with, instead of rebutting them, you say, tell me more. And in a dialogue, you want to understand why the other person feels the way they do. And in that process, you also want to share why you feel the way you do. So it's not just you're giving a fact or a historical event. You're also talking about how that impacted you and your family, and maybe even your grandparents, and your cultural, your religious identity, your sense of safety, your sense of home. And dialogue takes a lot more time than debate. So what we do in Seeds of Peace is, we start with over very simple things like, is TikTok better than Instagram? Is pizza better than falafel? Questions like that. And then gradually we turn those debates into dialogue by adding in different rules. So some of the rules we might make are, before you speak, you have to repeat what the person said to you before you speak. And before you speak, you have to take a breath. You have to pause for 30 seconds. You have to respond to what they said with empathy. And by adding in these rules, the debates turn into dialogue. And then we help the children identify what's happening to their body during the dialogue. Are they becoming comfortable? Are they becoming uncomfortable? Do they want to withdraw? Do they want to attack? Is this new territory for them? And often we do this with topics they're not political. Like, they're very innocent topics, but it's done as an exercise so that by the time we do get to the more political and contentious topics, they have that skill, they have that muscle of how to talk to people they disagree with. And that's something that a lot of children in this land don't have, and frankly, a lot of adults don't either. And I think that if you're trying to build a culture of peace in this land for Israelis and Palestinians, then teaching these skills of dialogue and of empathy and of understanding is one of the most important first steps you can take.
Yeah, I want to go back to October 7th, because you said it was a tremendous betrayal for all Israelis. But for those that were living in the communities, the kibbutzim down south by the Gaza border, they were the soldiers of peace. They were the ones that were like doing so much to create a two-state solution, doing so much to create peace between both of these people. How do we move forward from this and keep forging a path towards a real and lasting peace?
Yeah, so the people that were killed on October 7th weren't just people who believed in peace. They were people killed of all political opinions. Yes, Kfar Aza and Be'eri are definitely more to the left politically, but there was also a lot of people were killed in Sderot and in Ashdod and in Ashkelon from missile fire, and Bedouins were killed as well. So the terror didn't discriminate between people with political opinions on October 7th. I think that's important to remember. And also the heroes on October 7th didn't discriminate. There were people who saved other people on October 7th who were Jews, who were Muslims. There were several Bedouins who ran into Kibbutz Be'eri to save people. There was a Bedouin bus driver who drove back and forth to the Nova and ferried about 15 people out of gunfire. So I think the story of October 7th is more complex than the people on the left were attacked. I think people from all political spectrums were attacked, and Jews and Muslims showed great heroism on that day as well in standing up to save one another as well from the Hamas terror. In terms of what happened to people politically after October 7th, it's very true that Israel moved. Israel was already fairly on the right before October 7th, but it moved further to the right after that event because I think it solidified what a lot of people already believed about peace being impossible and our neighbors wanting to destroy us. And I think it's a very understandable reaction to that horror. But there was also people who were on the left who moved further to the left. I know, for example, Yonatan Zeigen, who was the son of Vivian Silva, who was an Israeli-Canadian Jew who was murdered in Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th. And he responded to her murder not by calling for revenge, but by building a soup kitchen in Gaza with her name on it. And he said, the way to honor my mother is by feeding hungry children in Gaza. That's also a response to October 7th. Is it the response that every Israeli is going to take? No. But people like him, in 2 weeks, he's going to be participating in a joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial service where Israelis and Palestinians who've lost loved ones in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Ashkelon, even people from this last war in Iran will come together and remember their loved ones together. So there's a range of responses that people have to trauma, and some are to fight harder, and some are to forgive and to find a way to make sure that the suffering I'm experiencing at this moment is never experienced by anyone else.
How do we get to empathy?
I'll do a little exercise with you, Carl. I want you to think
Okay.
for a moment about someone that you have a strong disagreement with. Okay, do you have that person in your mind?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you imagine sitting with them in a room for an hour, what goes through your mind?
I feel like we're going to argue because we're
Yeah.
already at a point where we can't talk to each other.
So it's probably something you try and avoid, right?
Yes.
That person
Yes.
you have in your mind, you're not inviting them to your Pesach Seder.
No.
No. And they probably, I would assume they feel the same way about you.
Probably you're correct. Yes.
Yeah. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that person is not just a random person. It's a member of your family. It's your brother, it's your sister, it's your son, your daughter, your mother, your father. And you have decided that despite your political differences, you need to have a Pesach Seder together. You need to have a Shabbat meal together, or you need to be at each other's weddings or birthdays or special life events. You don't have a choice to ignore each other. And so you decide that you're actually going to have a chat about the thing that you disagree with. So that first step is really, really hard because you have to overcome that sort of antagonism you feel towards that person, the desire not to be in the same room with them. You have to come to accept that it might be in the interests of a third person or even yourself to have a connection with this person. Maybe you have to do business with them. Maybe both of your children go to the same school and you want to get along for the sake of your kids, whatever it is. And so then you sit in that, having that conversation. And so that's what I help people do. And when they are ready to sit in the room together, the last thing they should talk about is the thing they disagree about. Because as soon as they talk about that topic, and whether it's Israel, Palestine, gun violence, abortion, Trump, whatever issue, immigration is dividing them, that's not where I'd start. I'd start talking about their life story Tell me how you became Carl. How did you become the person you are? What happened in your childhood? Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your loved ones. Tell me about what excites you in life. What projects are you working on? And then I would let the other person do the same thing. And for the first 20 minutes, you're not talking about that political issue. You're just talking about the things that make you human. And invariably in those conversations, you'll find that you have things in common. Maybe both your parents came from the same village in Lithuania. Maybe you both go for the same football team. Maybe you both, are allergic to avocado. I don't know. Like you find
You find
things
the
that
common ground.
you find
Yes.
things and you find things that you can connect to that person that aren't that political difference. I'll tell you a story. We took kids to Northern Ireland in 2019 from Seeds of Peace, and we had 4 Jews, and we were sitting with Catholic and Protestant politicians in Stormont. This is in the Parliament in Belfast, and they were both part of political parties that had tried to literally kill each other during the Troubles that ended in 1998. And we said to them, how the hell did you negotiate a peace process and become friends and sit in Parliament together now and laugh and tell jokes? And like, what's going on here? We didn't get how people that were from these paramilitaries were sort of all of a sudden friendly. And they said, whenever we had our peace process, these 2 people were people that negotiated the Good Friday Accords. They said for the first 3 hours, we didn't talk politics. We always just had a meal together. And I imagine an Irish meal involves a lot of beer as well. But they, and they said before we talked politics, which we knew, where our differences were, we talked about our children. We talked about what kind of education we want. And we talked about everything, the weather, clothing, shopping, like all of the normal things that people talk about with people who are their friends. And I know that's a really hard thing to do during war, but if you want to end it, you have to begin with that process of humanization. And it's a slow process, and sometimes it's like, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's not simple. It's messy, but it's so much better than the alternative.
Do you worry that we're going to have more steps back than going forward?
The things that cause dialogue to explode is often things that have nothing to do with the people in the dialogue. It's things to do with politicians, to do with social media, to do with, a certain politician has said an inflammatory comment and made everyone upset, or done an inflammatory thing, or God forbid, killed a lot of people. And so often what destroys the dialogue is people look at the political reality and they say, well, this is a waste of time. I shouldn't engage in this because as long as person X or Y is in politics, then all this dialogue is a waste of time. So often what we need to overcome is not the people in the room who come with a lot of goodwill to listen and understand one another, but it's actually the people in power that we don't have an ability to change at the moment. So to do dialogue well, you need to be very resilient as well to overcome, not just sort of your own personal demons, but overcome the reality of what's going on around you. We've just experienced in Palestine and Israel 40 days where all of us were under Iranian missile attack and running to shelters and not sleeping very well and experiencing a deep loss of safety and fear for our future and, what would happen to us and, threats of civilizations being wiped out and all. It's really scary stuff. And not everyone can do dialogue in that scenario. But I think that, my hope is that the peace process needs to happen in 2 ways. There needs to be a bottom-up peace process, which is what I'm working on in Seeds of Peace together with all the other organizations in OLMEP. And there also needs to be a top-down peace process, which involves the politicians.
Change directions here because there's a lot of, I would say, kids out there that are now growing up into their 30s and 40s who believed they were duped about Israel when they were growing up. And my question is, why are young people so surprised Israel has flaws?
Look, I've got a whole chapter on this in my book because, as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in Australia, even though I was born in Israel. And I was a high school teacher there for 15 years. And I taught in many Jewish and Zionist schools. And I was also a history teacher as well. And something I often found interesting was whenever I would teach history or English or Australian history, I was giving information and the kids had to remember that information and then write an essay about it or whatever it was. And when I was teaching Israel studies or Jewish studies, the first focus was that they should love. They should love Hanukkah. They should love Pesach. They should love Israel. They should role play Theodore Herzl having a debate about Uganda. They should pretend that they're in the Palmach, or these sorts of things. And I think there's something about the fact that every faculty in the school had teachers, and the Jewish studies faculty also had an informal education department, meaning that we weren't teaching just the information. We were also then having summer camps and Havdalah and musical experiences and things that spoke to your head as well as your heart. And I always wondered, the math faculty never had a day about let's love Pythagoras, or let's embrace the x in algebra, or have a debate between x and y when they're or the elements in the periodic table. They were just taught in a sort of way that information was given over. So then when things change in science or mathematics or in English, people don't get upset about it. But when somehow something in Judaism or Israel is different to the way you were taught, because you were taught in a very emotive way, it's very difficult for a lot of children to sort of become adults and realize that. And I would raise that conversation a lot with other teachers. And I said, why do we teach Jewish studies and Israel studies in such a different way from every other subject? And they said, well, it's sort of like a relationship, and when you're trying to fall in love with a person, you don't see their flaws. You just talk about how beautiful they are, and you take them out on beautiful dates, and you get them flowers. And that's how a lot of people in the Jewish community learn about Israel. They learn about Israel by falling in love with the country and the religion and the culture and the songs and the music and the food and the beautiful photos and imagery and videos that you see of, these scenic footages of Israel from above, and the Kotel and Israeli innovation and all of that sort of thing. And it's okay to fall in love in the beginning of a relationship, but a healthy relationship isn't just two people in love with each other, looking at each other's eyes every day and saying you're beautiful. A healthy relationship is the ability to criticize one another, to see each other's flaws, to understand each other's history and baggage. And so I don't have a problem with education that causes people to have a deep connection for a certain country. But if it ends at that, then that's a very bad education. And that education should continue into adulthood, where you do see the reality of what Israel is and what it is, especially to Palestinians, and to see, how wars are fought and the cost of those wars and how decisions are made. And I have a lot of critiques about the current Israeli government. And I think that should be part of education, no less than learning about the Tanakh and stories of Moses and Joshua, because I think to have a well-rounded Jewish identity and a well-rounded, connection to Israel, then you need to have the full picture. So in my book, I write what I just said now, but then I also have several chapters where I sort of retell Israeli and Palestinian history in a way that is a dual narrative, in a way that I think would foster peace rather than alienation or dehumanization.
I also want to talk about the newspapers, because you talk about getting different sources. And I think that's really important. If you read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, if you read the Jerusalem Post, and you read Haaretz, you read all the different papers, Al Jazeera, you're going to get a different perspective on what's happening. And can you talk to that?
Yeah, so I started this once. I did an exercise with my students where I gave them two articles about the same event that happened on the same day, one from a right-wing source and a left-wing source. And I told the students, can you tell me which is the right-wing source and which is the left-wing source? And they had no idea how to do that. And then I said, okay, let's break this down. Look at the language used. And I said, look at how here the territory is called Judea and Samaria, and here the territory is called the West Bank. And here the people are called Arabs, and here they're called Palestinians. And here this is called the West Bank Wall against terrorism, and here's it called the Apartheid Wall. And here it's called a war of self-defense, and here it's called a genocide. And I showed them how to sort of identify language in the same story about the same political event that had happened that day. And by identifying that language, they could see what is the bias of the article and whether the journalist is coming from the left or the right, or an Israeli or a Palestinian point of view. And so I list all of those words in the book as well. And then I go through different news sources as well that I use and how I sort of decode news contexts. I have that also on my website, itai.au, because I think that's also a really important tool for peace building. because dialogue is really, really hard to do when you and I have different facts. Because if you and I have different facts, we're not talking about the same thing. And when we're not
Yes.
talking about the same thing, then we can't talk about something because you think X happened and I think Y happened. And of course you're upset about that and I'm upset about this. And we don't have any commonality. Like you could be talking about a tragedy that I'm not even familiar with.
So if I see like, oh, Israel's committing a genocide,
Hmm.
it shuts me down.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you get past that? I've had this discussion with people
Hmm.
who have told me that Israel's committing genocide. And what I believe is going on there is terrible, but I don't think it's a genocide. So how do you get past that language?
Yeah. So there's a few ways to do that, and it really depends on, again, who you're talking about to and whether you're invested in the conversation and what the outcome of the interaction is. So one of the worst places to have these conversations is in the comment section of Instagram or Facebook. And that's not a place you're going to find a lot of enlightenment or, thoughtful definitions of words and language. But again, if this is a person that you care about and that they care about you as well, and you want to have this conversation, and there's a word that they use: self-defense, Zionism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, Nakba, Holocaust, all of these kinds of words, and you think they mean something and someone else thinks they mean someone else, then I would just start off with exactly what you said to me. When you use that word, it makes me feel, this. And what do you mean by that word? And then you can say what you mean by that word as well. And you'll often find that the same word can mean many, many different things to different people. So I'll give you another example is the word Zionism. So a lot of Jews use the word Zionism to mean the right of Israel to exist, or the belief that Israel should exist as a Jewish and democratic state. And a lot of Palestinians will use the word Zionism to mean a process of forced removal of Palestinians from their land. And for many Palestinians, that was the outcome of Zionism in 1948. And for Palestinians in Gaza, it's been the outcome of this last war. And so the use of one term or another will differ greatly on who is using it and why they're using it. And so again, when people say words that I find confronting or challenging, I ask them, what do those words mean? Why you're using it? This is how it makes me feel. This is my, when I think of genocide, I think of Treblinka. That's the first thing that comes to my mind because I'm a Holocaust educator. I've been to Treblinka. I've seen the trains. I've seen the people, the stories of people that came there and within 2 hours were burned in furnaces and in gas chambers. And so that's what I hear when I hear the word genocide. And I know that didn't happen in Gaza. And I think what happened in Gaza wasn't a genocide. But then someone else tells me the genocide means something very different to what Treblinka was. And then they give a specific legal definition that obviously is now before the courts, which Israel may or may not be guilty of. That's something for the court to decide. But I think that understanding what these words mean and how they're part of how we feel about history is important. And again, after you have that conversation, don't stop there. Then talk about what next. What do you want to see happen? What's your hope for Israelis and Palestinians and for Jerusalem and for what do you want? What kind of life do you want for the people who live there, and how can you work to build that? Because I think that when our conversations only focus on the past or on history, then they often lead to a dead end of you said this, I said this, well, we disagree. But when they start getting to be about the future, then there's a lot more to talk about.
I want to talk about Rachel Goldberg Poland, who you have a poem in your book she read at the UN. Her son Hirsch was taken hostage and murdered in Gaza. She says we have to think about it differently. And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah,
How to
so
make
the
peace?
poem that I have of Rachel, who is, I think, a huge inspiration for me in the way that she advocated for Hirsch without engaging in dehumanization, with obviously acknowledging the humanity of her son and her grief, but also acknowledging, in all of her speeches, the suffering that was existing for many innocent people in Gaza throughout his time in captivity, which is not an easy thing to do when your son is held hostage. And at one point, she shared a poem at the UN called "To the Boys in the Room," which I asked her permission to include in the book. And she highlighted something that a lot of commentators didn't highlight, which is the fact that the negotiations to both bring in aid into Gaza and the suffering of people in the Strip and to release the hostages was almost entirely done by men. And so the poem that she wrote was called "To the Boys in the Room," and she imagines what would have happened if the people doing these negotiations were Palestinian mothers with hungry children, or Israeli mothers whose children were starving hostages in tunnels of Hamas. And she imagines that if women were leading those negotiations, then perhaps it wouldn't have taken several hundred days for these children to come home. And unfortunately, her son should have come home because, he was on a list that should have been enacted and part of a deal, but that deal was never signed. And then other children did come home, but obviously much, much later than after Hirsch was killed. And so I think that there's an important message from that whenever there are negotiations about peace and security, largely women are absent. And if women are in the room, statistically, and I give studies for this in the book, there's a much, much higher likely chance that those negotiations will end up in long-term peace agreement than if women are excluded from that process. And so I think it's very important, in addition to many of the other things that we need to change about the conflict. Another thing we need to change is to stop excluding women from negotiations about peace and security.
And as we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked that I did not ask?
No, but maybe if I can just finish off by saying that, a lot of people listening to this will say that I'm naive or I'm delusional or I'm not sort of reading the map as the way they read it. And perhaps they're right. And perhaps it's true that I'm not, in the same sort of news cycle that everyone else is. Because I live in a little bubble where when I go to work, I go to an office where people are speaking Hebrew and Arabic, and Israelis are wishing Palestinians happy birthday, and Palestinians are wishing Israelis a happy Pesach, and we are part of each other's lives and we care for each other. And I'm in this little oasis that's experiencing peace. That's not the reality for the vast, vast majority of people who live in this land. And maybe that's why I am a bit naive and delusional, but I hope that by, being on this podcast and writing this book, that I can pass on the experience that we have in Seeds of Peace to other people, so that people can begin to work for justice, for reconciliation, for truth, for honesty in the communities wherever you live. There's conflict in every place on earth. And hopefully that some of the techniques that we have developed to do this in Jerusalem can be used in other places, because I think so many people are in deep need of healing at the moment, and I hope I'm able to contribute to that in some way.
Well, I'll say we need your delusion and your naivety, because I think that's the only way forward, is if we all learn how to talk to each other. Yeah. And I don't think there's any other way for us to make peace if we don't learn to see each other. And we have to all see each other, because I think we're all struggling and striving for that day. Itai Fleischer, thank you so much for joining me today. The book is The Holy and the Broken. You can get that where you get your books. Let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comment section. And until next time, everyone, be safe.
Thank you.